So, we talked about the social and political landscape of the 13 colonies, the last the last time I talked to you. Today we are going to largely look at the societal impact of living in the colonies. So, on Google Classroom, there is a link. I don't know what video it is, but it does say Colonial Life, and that's where we are going to be looking at today. We are going to first topic, and it's a big one, is the origins of slavery. It's the slavery origin story. So, without any further ado, let's start with the origins of slavery. The origins of slavery can be traced back much further than the 18th and 19th century plantations in the southern United States. By the time the English had begun to settle permanent colonies in North America, the Spanish and Portuguese had developed a model of slavery to provide labor for commercial agriculture. This model was critical for the development of slavery in Anglo-America. The development of the slave trade began with the Portuguese exploration of West Africa, primarily from Senegal to Angola. In the 15th century, with funding from Prince Henry, a patron of scientists and devoted his life to sponsoring innovation, the Portuguese sent expeditions to West Africa in hopes of finding gold and later an eastern-western passage to facilitate trade with Asia. In 1441, Captains Antonio Goncalves and Nano Tristeo led a voyage to Cabo Branco on the Atlantic bulge of Africa, returning with gold, ostrich eggs, and 20 slaves, beginning a 4-century traffic in Africa's across the Atlantic world. Slavery had existed in Africa prior to the arrival of Europeans, although it did not take the form it would assume in the Western Hemisphere. There it would become integrally connected to commercial agriculture and result in defining the slave as chattel or personal property. In the African system, slavery was not generational. A child did not become a slave to his mother's owner. Furthermore, under the African system, slaves were not defined as property, and they could rise to positions of influence. Under this system, slavery was not racially prescribed. So, slavery had a much different feeling, even though it was considered bad to us in the 21st century. It had a very much different aspect of it in Africa compared to the European system. To facilitate and increase their African trade, the Portuguese built several fortified outposts along the African coast. One of these posts was Elmina, the mine, founded in 1482, which became the first exchange point for slaves on the West African mainland. Coastal tribes captured slaves from the African interior and shipped them to these coastal outposts. These journeys were difficult, and it is estimated that 40% of the captured slaves perished before reaching the coast. Under Portuguese and later Dutch control, Elmina served as a major trading post for shipping slaves to the Americas. So we are talking shipping slaves directly from Africa to America now. Africans brought people captured in raids and wars to Elmina and other such ports, exchanging them for European goods such as mirrors, knives, cloves, beads, iron, guns, and gunpowder. By the early 1500s, the slave trade was well established. It would grow exponentially with an estimated 50 million Africans either becoming slaves or dying en route to slave outposts during the 17th and 18th centuries. Of this 50 million, 10 to 15 million were sent to the New World, primarily South America and the West Indies. However, 400,000 of those slaves landed in North America, primarily at auction blocks in Newport, Rhode Island, and Charleston. So, slavery was alive and well in the 13 colonies, mainly because slaves. So, I want to draw you another graphic. I'm gonna draw you, but it's a lot more confusing. So, we have Europe. Again, I don't have my whiteboard, so I can't draw you, or my map, so it might be very confusing to some of you. So, I have America, Europe, and Africa right here, right? So, slaves would go from Africa to America, right? They would make this stuff, they would produce goods for, so Europe can make this stuff. So stuff, and Europe would send goods to Africa to keep the triangular trade going. So slaves would go to America. So they will produce like cotton and rice and stuff, and to make goods in Europe to be shipped to Africa. And then this whole line goes. So that's your rough analogy of the triangular trade. Okay. When the Spanish and Portuguese established their own colonies in the Western Hemisphere They tried to recreate the system of bound labor that had emerged on their Atlantic islands. The most obvious source of such labor was the indigenous peoples, but using native labor was problematic, especially as Indian populations decreased in size in the face of European-borne diseases like smallpox, diphtheria, and tuberculosis, for which the natives had very little immunity. In some areas, including various Caribbean islands, the native population vanished entirely. As a result, planters searching for labor had to find alternatives, which they found in the African slave trade. When the English began to colonialize America, they had no experience with slavery. However, as they discovered a marketable crop and realized there was relatively unavailability of European-born servants, they turned to slavery. Such a process occurred on the English colony of Barbados, where planters struggled to find a viable export. They eventually found it in sugarcane introduced by Dutch merchants eager to add the crop to their cargoes. The rise of sugarcane cultivation initiated major changes on the island. Planters cut down the jungles and turned virtually every inch of land into sugar cultivation. The most successful formed an elite that amassed increasing amounts of land, labor, and wealth. As demand for labor increased, such men first turned to indentured servants, men and some women who were willing to bind their labor for typically 4 to 7 years in return for their passage. So this system was, I would pay for passage for you and your family from England to the New World. But in return, you have to give me 5 to 7 years of your labor at my plantation. This system was very effective. Upon completing their terms of service, they were issued freedom dues, which could include seeds for planting, new clothes, or even land, although this was rare. Newly released indentured servants were free to make their own living in the New World. So they were no longer tied when they got free from indentured servitude. Planters were willing enough to use servants, but the sheer brutality of sugar cultivation and the urge to squeeze as much labor out of a servant's relatively short term of indenture eventually soared the English on indenturing themselves to barbarian landowners. Moreover, freed servants found it virtually impossible to buy land, since the island's small surface had been taken over by the large sugar planters. As the supply of servants dwindled, planters looked to slaves. Dutch traders and later English ones were happy to oblige. In turn, Barbados and other English West Indies colonies would eventually provide the first regular source of slaves for American mainland planters. However, horrific conditions on slave voyages limited the number of slaves that arrived on the mainland. So treatment in these slave trips were brutal. These middle voyage treks each carried hundreds of African slaves chained by their neck and extremities on the cargo deck. In most cases, the slaves were so crowded in that they had to lay on their back for the entire trip. Some captains allowed the slaves to be washed regularly, but harsher ones kept the slaves captive, laying in their own extremities for the 3 to 6 month voyage. These conditions were a breeding ground for diseases, and between 1 and 2 million slaves died en route. So he's talking, the middle voyage is the trip between Africa to America. And on that trip, there was 3 to 6 months of harsh conditions for the slaves. Planters were willing enough to use servants, but the sheer brutality of sugar cultivation and the urge to squeeze as much labor out of the servants' relatively short term of indenture eventually soared the English on indenturing. Sorry, guys. Slavery took a far longer time to develop in England's first permanent colony, Virginia, than it had in the West Indies. John Smith had hoped to integrate natives into the Jamestown settlement, but his strong-arm tactics caused the natives to regard the infant colony with attitudes ranging from wariness to hostility, unwilling to enter any kind of long-term cooperation relationship with the English. The natives certainly did not allow themselves to become English chattel. Furthermore, these natives of the eastern woodlands would prove poor subjects for slavery. Their numbers declined in the face of disease, their value of individual autonomy and their agricultural methods did not translate easily into the kinds of collectivized agriculture slavery fostered.